Today I'm talking to the author of Japanese steampunk novel Stormdancer. Welcome, Kristoff.
Thanks for having me.
You say you're a tragic nerd.
Yeah. Yes.
So why do you say you're a tragic nerd?
Pretty much everything stereotypically nerdy that a person can do, I probably do it. I've been playing role-playing games since I was 12 years old and have a big old collection of nerdy fantasy books and comic books in my study, and play computer games, video games, and collectible card games and all kinds of embarrassing stuff. So yeah, as far as the nerd A to Z goes, I've probably done everything.
Your bio says you've spent the last 10 years dumping XPs into your intimidation stack, and now no one is brave enough to say it to your face.
Yeah, I think probably because I'm 6'7". You can't tell because I'm sitting on a couch now, but I'm a pretty big gent, and I'm not short across the shoulders either. So I think most people's first impressions of me are that I'm kind of big and dark and scary looking. I'm not like that in real life at all. If you speak to me for 2 minutes, you'll find out that I'm pretty introverted and kind of a big puppy dog. But first impressions, people tend to get a little bit scared of me. I think I've had instances where people won't sit next to me on the tram or on the bus just because I look frightening. I'm not sure what it is about me, but yeah, it was worse when I had long hair and I had a nose ring and all kinds of scary stuff in my younger days, so I can understand that, but now not so much.
So you think you look quite conservative these days in comparison?
In comparison, yeah. I used to, in my younger days, I used to be in a band, so I was, yeah, like I say, I had hair down to my butt, and I used to put spikes in my goatee, and I had a septum ring and all kinds of less than sensible facial decoration. But yeah, nowadays it's just glasses and kind of unshaved pseudo beard. So yeah, things are a lot tamer nowadays.
You've got an arts degree. What was your goal in getting that degree?
I wanted to be a graphic designer when I was in high school. Art, as in drawing, was kind of the subject that I enjoyed most, probably along with history. So, when you get handed that big old CES book when you're 14 years old that has a kind of list of every job in the world in it, I flick through the jobs that, an arts aptitude would be useful for, and graphic design seemed to be the smartest choice. So that's what I studied for the first couple of years, but I ended up majoring in advertising in the end, and became what's called an art director, which is in advertising agencies, creative teams are organized in terms of copywriters and art directors are the guys who are responsible for the visual elements of any given ad. In terms of thinking the ideas, especially where TV scripts are concerned, it's more a collaborative effort, but in the end the copywriter writes the words and the art director does the pictures. That's a really simplistic way of looking at it, but yeah, that's kind of what I did for 10, 11 years. And eventually I got out of that. I got advertising is kind of weird. You spend a lot of your creative energy on selling stuff to people, making them spend money they don't have on shit they don't need. So it's not all that fulfilling in terms of a way to spend your creative energy. So I got out of it after about 10 or 11 years, I think, and moved into a job that's a little less creative, and that gave me more time to write, essentially, to spend my creativity on something that I wanted to create for myself.
Mm-hmm. So what are you doing these days?
Typography was kind of where it all started.
Cool. So what are you doing these days?
I work in marketing, online marketing. So it's a similar discipline, but I work client side now as opposed to agency side. So I'm the guy who hires the guy who does what I used to do.
Okay.
So it's more administrative and, like I say, a little less creative, but that's good because it kind of frees up my dog barking. It frees up my creativity to, like I say, spend on my own stuff.
Mm. Yeah. So I don't need to ask the next few questions about selling your soul in advertising for 10 years. And you even won awards, though.
Yeah, we won a few. Like I say, you work in a team situation in an advertising agency. So, yeah, me and a few of the writers that I've worked with over the years have won a couple of awards. But awards in advertising are one of those things that no one outside advertising really cares about. Like, if you're a film director or an actor or something, you win an Academy Award is kind of a big deal. If you win a gong at the Australian Art Directors Awards, no one really gives a shit other than other people in advertising. So it's cool while you're in the game, but it's not such a big deal nowadays, I guess.
Do you think this background's helped you with your writing?
Yeah, I think so. Particularly in terms of writing television, because in a visual medium you have to show rather than tell. You can't, unless you're cutting away to overdubs. You can't show what a character is, or you can't tell what a character is thinking. You have to show what they're thinking by their actions, and that's kind of one of the golden rules of writing, really, to show rather than tell. So I think that's definitely helped. I think. A lot of people have said my writing style is quite visual. I kind of write like a movie, like I was telling a movie rather than a novel. So I think that probably spills over from the visual design background that I had. And I think also when you're writing television or posters or print work, you have to get to the core of the idea. You have to strip away a lot of the layers and get to the truth of the communication, and I think that probably helps as well. I mean, you have a lot more room to play with in a book, obviously, but when you're writing a script that consists of maybe 100 words, you have to get to the point pretty quick. So I think that's probably helped as well.
Yeah. What inspired you to start writing?
I'd always written as a hobby, particularly. I mean, it started really with role playing. I'm kind of been building worlds in one way or another for 20 years since I was a kid. So I always wrote, and I spent a lot of that writing energy when I was younger, as in role playing and role playing clubs and whatever. As I got older, I got out of that game a little bit and wrote for fun. But when you're writing all day, as I used to do when I was working in advertising, when you're writing scripts and print work all day, the last thing you want to do really is come home and write more. So it was a seed that probably went to sleep for a few years, and I didn't do all that much of it. But when I got out of advertising and moved on to a less writing intensive job, that desire kind of woke up again, and I started out really writing kind of 1-2 hours a day. I would take a laptop into a meeting room at work on my lunch break and just bash out 1,000 words. And I probably wrote 80% of my first book, which will never see the light of day, that way. And I wrote probably 70-80% of Stormdancer as well on my lunch breaks at work. So nowadays I spend a lot more than that writing, of course, but yeah, that's where it started. So I think the desire was always there, but it was kind of eaten for a long time by the fact that I was writing for a living. I think it would be really difficult to write for a living and write novels as a hobby. So yeah, I'm kind of glad I got out and freed myself up in that respect.
What authors have influenced you?
In terms of style, you mean? Writing style? Or
style and content?
I think stylistically I probably get a lot from, I think probably my biggest influence would be William Gibson. He's kind of a big fan of, he has a really kind of fragmented, short, choppy style. There's a kind of underlying menace in a lot of what he writes. And I think I've picked up on a lot of that. In terms of where my ideas come from, the writers that have influenced my ideas, I don't know, probably every writer that I've ever read. It started out when I was kind of 10 years old. My mother would drop me off at the news agency when she would go and do the grocery shopping every week, and I would sit down in the book aisle and just pick up a Stephen King book and kind of read for an hour while she was doing the grocery shopping. You know, when you're 10 years old, Stephen King books are pretty thick, so I used to skip to all the good bits, the gory bits. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of where it started. I remember first reading The Hobbit when I was maybe 8 or 9 years old, and that was the first fantasy book that I ever read. I didn't know there was such a thing as fantasy books up until that point. So it's kind of it's almost trendy to rip on Tolkien nowadays. It's kind of not hip to like him, but if it wasn't for that book, if it wasn't for Tolkien, I might never have awoken to the idea of fantasy and sci-fi. So, but I read a lot of sci-fi when I was growing up. I was probably more of a sci-fi fan than a fantasy fan. So, you know, Philip K. Dick and Isaac Asimov and Piers Anthony, Robert Heinlein, you know, all those kind of great sci-fi writers. And I think they probably have an influence on me more than I realize as well. Mm. When I'm writing fantasy, there tends to be a sci-fi feel to a lot of the fantasy that I write. So, yeah.
What other media, apart from books, has influenced you?
Probably everything. Film and television especially. I love watching good television series. I'm watching The Shield at the moment, which I don't know whether you've seen it, but I think it's one of the greatest television series ever written. I recently watched The Wire as well, kind of on a bit of a cop show trip at the moment. And the writing in those shows is so incredibly sharp. Some of the scenes in The Wire are I don't know, have you seen The Wire at all? Have you watched it?
I'm watching it at the moment.
Oh, wow, okay. Yeah, there's a couple of scenes in that show that just make the hair on my arms stand up. Like, they're so incredibly well written. There's a scene, I think it's in the first or second episode of the first season, where D'Angelo is teaching Bodhi and Wallace how to play chess. And the writing in it is just incredible. It makes me almost cry. It's so good. So, so I've been watching some great television that influences me a lot. I mean, I'm a huge film buff. I've got a massive DVD collection. So, yeah, great storytelling and great directing. You know, some of my favorite directors would be guys like David Fincher. I'm a big David Fincher fan. And I read a lot of comic books when I was growing up as well. Like, I was a big Marvel boy, not a DC boy. So, writers like Neil Gaiman and who else? Frank Miller, Alan Moore, all those kind of huge doyens of the comic book scene. They were kind of writing those books like Sandman and Watchmen were literally coming out when I started reading comic books for the first time. So it was kind of a really exciting time to be getting into that media. So yeah, anything and everything really. Real life as well, I guess. Knowing some amazing people and trying to surround myself with interesting people. I mean, that they probably inform me more than any static media that I interact with.
Mm. Stormdancer began as a dream.
It did, yeah. I was querying my first book at the time, which was a horror novel, I guess you'd describe it as. And I wasn't getting a lot of success. Some agents had said nice things about the writing style, but in terms of the marketability of the book, it was a vampire novel, and it was in the middle of Twilight hysteria, so selling a vampire book back then was pretty hard. But I got enough encouragement from agents in terms of style to keep going, and I was kind of at the tail end of the query process on that book and thinking about what I was going to write next. And I had a dream about a little boy standing in a field of dead grass, and he was standing in front of a griffin, and he was screaming at it, trying to get it to fly, but its wings were broken at the biceps, so whenever it tried to get off, its wings would just kind of flap around. It was a little bit grotesque, but that image just stuck in my head. The idea of a griffin that couldn't fly was an image that I couldn't really let go. It's kind of weird. We have these fantasy creatures that are defined by their abilities. You know, dragons can breathe fire and griffins can fly and basilisks can turn people to stone and whatever. When you take away that kind of key ability, what you're left with is hopefully a really interesting character. So yeah, that's where it all started.
And yet Stormdancer has a female protagonist.
It does. I don't know why I wrote a female protagonist. It's really interesting that people tend to ask me about that a lot. And Joss Whedon did a really great speech a little while ago when he was accepting an Equality Now award. He was telling a story about how he always gets asked why he writes really strong female characters, and he has a bunch of different answers over the course of him telling the story. But ultimately, the answer that he gave was because people keep asking him that question. And so whenever anyone asks me that question, I'm kind of stuck following Joss Whedon's footsteps. He's a pretty hard act to follow. But I think there's a real truth to that, the idea that it is somehow remarkable that a male author writes a female character. Ideally, I'd like to live in a world where it's completely unremarkable. It's not a big deal. The notion that writers somehow have a default setting of writing in their own gender, it seems a little weird to me. And I think maybe I'm afraid of Gary Stu accusations. You know, when you write a male character and you're a male author, the immediate default setting from a lot of readers would be thinking that it's some kind of wish fulfillment, or that you're putting yourself into your character, and that's, you know, something quite easily avoided if you write outside your comfort zone. But also, I mean, it's maybe a little harder. It's a little more challenging to write someone outside your gender. I mean, and I'm not sure whether it's any harder than writing any other kind of character that you're not and will never be. You know, if I was writing from the point of view of a police officer, I've never been a cop. I could do some research. I could talk to some police officers about their experiences, but I've never done that. I don't know what it's like to face down a criminal with a gun in his hand. You know, if I was writing a soldier, I've never had to fight for my life. I've never had to shoot somebody. So I think all writers are, to some degree, stepping outside their comfort zone and their own experience when they create any kind of character, unless you're writing an autobiography. So yeah, it seemed to fit the story better, the story that I had in mind. Because I mean, Stormdancer it's really a story about a girl's relationship with her father, and the dynamics between fathers and daughters are different to the dynamics between sons and fathers or sons and mothers. And the daughter-father dynamic really seemed to suit the story best in my mind. So, yeah, I just did what I thought was right for the story, and that happened to be a female protagonist.
One of the things that I liked most about Stormdancer was the father-daughter relationship and how that was explored. And yet that they were very estranged, and you worked through, like, you unpacked that and how children could love an absent father the way they did. Where did all that come from?
My dad wasn't around a lot when I was growing up. Not that he was an alcoholic or a drug addict or anything like that, like Yuki's dad is in Stormdancer, but he was just busy, I guess. I grew up. I don't want to make it sound like he was never there, but I spent a lot of time by myself, and kind of got comfortable with my own company in that respect. And it's only since I've grown older that me and my father have become friends. Like, our relationship has changed quite dramatically over the last kind of 20 years. I moved out when I was really young. We didn't really get along when I was younger. But now I consider him actually a friend, someone that I can pick up a telephone and just have a chat with about, not about father-son stuff, just about life, just about what's happening in general. And he's kind of the same with me now. So it's taken kind of 20 years to get to that point. But yeah, I think there probably is a little bit of my relationship with my father in there. Like I say, he wasn't quite the deadbeat that Yuki's father was, but yeah, thinking it wasn't even a conscious decision. It was only kind of after I wrote the book and a few people started asking me that question that I thought, yeah, probably there is a little bit of my relationship in there with my dad. But yeah, I think my relationship with my father probably had a happier ending than the one in the book. But yeah, I think there is some truth to that.
Your wife Amanda takes some credit for being a beta reader and telling you how girls think.
Yeah, she's really good in that respect. She's probably the most well-read person that I know. she devours books. Like, I'm quite a slow reader, and she just chews them up in a matter of days. So, and she reads very widely as well. She's not beholden to any particular genre. So she's great as a beta reader in that sense, because she can pick up, cliches and tropes that maybe I haven't been exposed to. Because I try to read as widely as I can, but time now. I'm still working a full-time job, and I'm still writing when I come home from work, so I can't read anywhere near as much as I would like. So she's great in that sense. If it's kind of been written, she's probably read it. So she's good in spotting paths that have already been trodden. But also, yeah, she is a woman, so I am writing from a male perspective, and I try to avoid maleisms, I guess, as much as I can. But given that she was a teenage girl back in the day, she's pretty good at spotting the points where I step too far into the male set of shoes. I mean, I try to stick to more universal truths for the crux of the story. I mean, relationships with absentee parents, like you were talking about, that's not a problem that's exclusive to teenage girls. But I mean, when you're getting down to the minutiae of the character and the way she thinks, the way she acts in certain situations, yeah, Amanda's great for picking up those gaffes that I make. And I think that's inevitable. I mean, given that I've never been a 16-year-old girl, as imaginative as I can be, I probably can't bring the same perspective as someone who has been there and done that. So yeah, she's great in that respect. She keeps me honest.
Great. Your story feature. Well, actually, it's probably better at this point in time if you could give us a blurb about Stormdancer.
It is a combination of steampunk and epic fantasy. It's set in a Japanese-inspired steampunk dystopia, I guess. It's an environment that's kind of on the verge of collapse. The industrialization that the country has gone through has kind of brought it to the pinnacle in terms of being a world power, but it's also wrought a pretty terrible toll on the environment, with the result that the nation is on the verge of collapse, and they're engaged in a war of aggression overseas in order to acquire more resources and more land in order to perpetuate the cycle. The pollution has killed most of the animal life on the islands, and the shogun, who's the leader of the society, he has a dream about leading his armies to victory on the back of a thunder tiger, which is a mythical beast that had been extinct for a century or more. And he takes this as an omen from the god of war, and so he sends out his hunt master to go and hunt him down a thunder tiger, even though they don't exist. And the hunt master brings a few of his apprentices and his daughter along for the trip, and hijinks ensue, I guess. But it's a story about a friendship between Yukiko, who's a heroine, and a thunder tiger that she names Peru, and how they ultimately go on to challenge the might of the empire, I guess.
I thought it was very interesting that Yukiko and Baru's relationship was a little bit reminiscent of Anne McCaffrey's Dragons of Pern, and yet Peru was very much the dominant one, whereas Anne McCaffrey's dragons are more like, yes, there's a relationship, but they're more like pets, whereas Peru wants to be dominant.
I haven't actually read Dragon Riders of Pern. That's probably one of the shortfalls in my fantasy catalogue. Like I say, I used to read a lot more sci-fi than fantasy. But yeah, I'm not sure where that dominance comes from. I think there's probably a little bit of me in Peru, the way he sees the world in particular, and the way he's like I say, he's kind of big and scary on the outside, but when you really get down to it, he's a bit of a puppy dog inside. I think there's probably a little bit of my truth in that. But in terms of him being dominant, yeah, I guess that's true. I'm not sure why that is. He developed really organically as a character. When I initially wrote him, he started out as he was intelligent from the get-go. He was kind of capable of complex thought and emotion when Yukiko initially met him. And it wasn't until kind of the second or third draft that I reduced him almost to an animal level intelligence when they first meet. And over the course of the book and through the bond that they share, he then develops that capability of rational thought and complex emotion and complex concepts. So, but yeah, he was always, I mean, he's kind of an alpha male in that respect. He's an apex predator where he comes from, and it kind of made sense to me that he would be aggressive and ferocious and kind of primal. I mean, he opens up that side of Yukiko. I mean, she's had to grow up a lot faster than, you know, a regular 16-year-old girl might otherwise have grown up, because she's had an absentee parent. She's had to be responsible, and she lives in a society where you're not free to say and do and act how you might think. It's a fairly repressive and restricted society. So Peru's primal and ferocious side kind of opens that doorway to Yukiko's psyche. So yeah, that seemed to be a kind of natural way to write him.
In your environment, the lotus is the source of all the wealth, but it's also the source of all the destruction. I'm just wondering why you made your lotus so different to the lotus, because the lotus in reality, they're water lilies.
Yeah.
So where did the connection come in?
In terms of using that specific flower?
Yeah.
I don't really have a good answer for that. It seemed to fit in my head. Yeah, it wasn't a conscious decision. It wasn't an inversion of the way things work in real life. I wasn't trying to make any statement in that respect. I just, lotus to me is a really beautiful flower. And the idea of tying up what, aesthetically is really quite beautiful and pretty to look at, but at the same time, it has this really destructive and negative effect on everything around it. And that notion kind of plays out a little more in subsequent books. I mean, I'm writing book 3 at the moment, and so you find out what the origin of the flower is and what is underlying this whole the meta plot, I guess you'd call it, to use a role-playing geek term. And yeah, so I kind of liked that dichotomy of something that looks really pretty on the surface, and on the surface, the idea of this combustible fuel and the technology and the power that it brings, it all seems really shiny and fantastic, but underneath there's a price to be paid. I kind of like that, that duality, I guess.
The lotus must bloom reminded me, every time I read it, it reminded me of the spice must flow. How influenced were you by June?
Say that again, sorry?
How influenced were you by June?
Not consciously. A couple of people have actually said that. I mean, there's the Spacer Guild in June, and there's a guild in my book as well. So I haven't read June in probably 20 years, but it is on my bookshelf. So yeah, maybe there was some subconscious influence going on there. It certainly wasn't an overt homage or anything to Frank Herbert, although I thought he was a great author. But yeah, it was probably some unintentional homage in there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. In your blog, you said, and I'll just read an excerpt. When I first pictured the islands in my head, I imagined a high-speed collision between the epic settings of feudal Japan and the fictions of Verne, Moore, and Gibson, smudged with a handful of soot and burned motor oil. Would you like to enlarge on that?
I think a lot of steampunk authors, they treat the advent of industrialization and the advent of the machine as this gateway to excitement and adventure and really wild things. I wanted to turn that idea on its head. I wanted to create a world where the machine was the enemy, not overtly out of any desire to point the finger at technology today, although some people have read the book and taken it as a critique on modern day technology and our disdain for the environment. And I think that's a valid interpretation of the book, but more just to do something a little bit different. Steampunk is traditionally, the machine is great, the machine is awesome, and industrialization is this fantastic thing. Whereas in reality, industrialization in our world came with a pretty hefty toll in terms of, child exploitation and slavery and widening of the gap between rich and poor. It wasn't 100% of fun 100% of the time. So yeah, I felt having a steampunk story where the machine was not necessarily a fantastic thing was maybe a little more honest. And yeah, it was just something different. I liked the idea of doing things a little differently, so that seemed to be a natural fit for me.
You haven't lived in Japan, as far as I can tell from your bio. So what research did you do to write Stormdancer?
Read a bunch of books, went to there's a couple of great online resources, like the Shinto Encyclopedia online probably has everything you need to know about the Shinto religion, mythology, whatever you want to call it. I have a couple of buddies who live in Japan as well, and they're married to women who were born in Japan, so they were really cool sounding boards in terms of the changes that I was going to make. I was particularly conscious of the changes that I was making to Shinto because it's still practiced today in some parts of Japan. So it is a religion in a very real sense of the word. So when you're messing around with those legends, you kind of have to approach it a little carefully, I think. I felt I should anyway. So I bounced a lot of ideas off Lance and Masaki and those guys who live in Japan in terms of the changes that I was going to make to make sure that I hopefully wasn't offending anybody. I mean, I haven't changed the mythology so much as I guess I've simplified it in some ways and I've added addenda in other ways. But I am distorting that mythology, that religion. So I thought it would be a really smart idea to bounce those ideas, those changes that I was going to make, and even in terms of the structures of society and language, I was conscious that I wasn't being 100% faithful to modern day Japan. But I mean, the book was never intended to be that. It's a Japanese inspired setting rather than an alt history of Japan. I mean, it's set in a place called Shima. Modern day Japan or historical Japan didn't have many griffins, as far as I'm aware. And even the griffin itself isn't a monster or a creature that's traditionally associated with Japanese folklore. There's nothing close to a griffin in Japanese legends. So yeah, it is a fantasy setting. But yeah, my Lance and Masaki in particular have been really awesome in terms of bouncing those ideas and bouncing those changes off to make sure that even if I wasn't being 100% faithful, at least I was sticking to the spirit of the text that I was being inspired by.
There's an ongoing debate about cultural acquisition, if or when it's okay to acquire another culture when you're writing. What thoughts do you have on that subject?
I think it's a really personal choice. I'm not sure there is 100% right or wrong answer. I think that some people will have a lower tolerance and a lower threshold to appropriation, or exoticism is another word that gets used a lot. Other people, I mean, coming from a Western society, I mean, living in Australia, everything that we have is kind of appropriated if you look at it from a technical point of view. I mean, white people have only lived here for 200 years. We borrow everything from America or from the UK or whatever. So I think it's by and large up to the individual, and I think people are going to have different opinions to me. I mean, I've been accused of it. I mean, Leon Hearn's been accused of it. So it's a matter of opinion, and I think everyone's opinion needs to be respected in that regard. I tried to be as respectful as I could, and like I say, I was conscious of the changes that I was making, and I was careful to bounce those changes off people who actually live in Japan and interact with that society every day. But regardless, I mean, Lance and Masaki and those guys, they're only giving me their personal opinion, and that personal opinion could differ from their next door neighbor or someone who has studied Japan or has lived there for a time. Or so I guess it's one of those things where you have to hope that the majority of people will accept the story in the spirit that it's given, and you have to be cognizant of the fact that some people are just going to be offended, and that's their right. As far as laying down a definition for me, what appropriation is, I think it comes down to a matter of intent. But like I say, it's a pretty personal matter. So I respect other people's opinion. I respect that other people's opinion are going to differ from mine. And like I say, hopefully the majority of people will accept these stories in the spirit they're given. And yeah.
Do you think that there's an argument for building bridges as opposed to the argument against cultural appropriation?
I think so, yeah. I mean, as a Westerner, I think a lot of our fantasy stories are quite guilty of a Western focus. And I mean, that's understandable because we have a Western background. It kind of comes back to what I was saying before about male writers writing female characters. The default setting for Western authors is writing Western settings, and that's probably not the way the world should be. It probably shouldn't be remarkable that a male author is writing a strong female character. It probably shouldn't be remarkable that a Western author is being inspired by non-Western culture. That seems to be the default setting. But I think maybe someone could approach this book and read about it and want to know more about Japanese history or Japanese mythology. And I think that would be a great thing. I've actually had a couple of people tell me that on Twitter and sending me emails. So it's cool if it can open that door to a different way of thinking and a different kind of experience, because those stories and that culture there are similarities in some of the tale of Izanagi and Izanami has some pretty striking parallels to the story of Orpheus and Eurydice and Hades and Persephone, even though those cultures were literally across the other side of the world from each other when they were created. But there are a lot of differences in the way that mythology and those cultures were built, what the precepts and what the rules and the way of thinkings were. So I think it's a cool thing if audiences have their eyes open to alternate ways of thinking and alternate ways of seeing the world. Absolutely.
Stormdancer has been translated into a number of different languages for release in several countries.
Sorry. We haven't actually started any of the translations yet. We've sold it in quite a few countries. We've been really lucky in that respect. But I'm actually really quite looking forward to the translation process. I don't know how that works. I've spoken to a couple of authors who've had their works translated into foreign languages. Pat Rothfuss ended up setting up kind of a message board system because he was being asked the same questions over and over again by a bunch of different translators, translating maybe the wind into a bunch of different languages. So I think it'll be really interesting to go through that process, because I don't speak any of the languages that it's being translated into. So, I can swear in French, but that's about it. So, yeah, it'll be a really interesting process, I think. But we haven't started that yet. We've sold in, I think maybe 7 or 8 countries now. But I think a lot of those countries wait until the book comes out in the UK and America, and then the process will start quite shortly, I think. But yeah, I'm looking forward to it. It'll be fun.
On that note, I'm going to mispronounce this name. Paolo Paredes says to send you a big hug from the guys in Portugal. I get the feeling they're looking forward to the book.
Oh, awesome. That's great. Well, big hugs back.
And what can you tell us about Lotus War Book 2, apart from the fact that you finished writing it?
Well, I'm I've finished the draft, so I've handed it in to my editors, and I'll be getting editors' notes back pretty soon, in the next week or two, I think. So it's not finished. It's kind of third draft finished. But what can I tell you without giving too much away? There's a couple of really massive spoilers that happen very early on in the book, and they kind of set the tone for the entire novel. So it's quite difficult to talk about without giving those huge spoilers away. But I mean, the first book was Yuki and Peru and their story. The second book is a little broader. It goes through that kind of two towers trap where, in Fellowship of the Ring, you've got 9 guys and they're kind of walking along in a nice straight little line and everything's quite linear. But at the end of that first book, the party gets shattered and kind of tears his hair out because now he's telling 3 different stories instead of one. So the same thing happens in the second book. I mean, there's a couple of characters that their fates are unanswered at the end of the first book. You don't quite know what happened to a few of them. So we follow their stories as well as Yuki and Peru. We're introduced to a couple of new characters that I hope people will like. One in particular, he's a lot of fun to write. And it'll be interesting to see how people react to him. But again, I can't go too much into detail because it's kind of spoilery. But and I guess the scope of the conflict gets a lot bigger. I can't talk about the end of the first book for people who haven't read it yet. But it becomes less of a one person versus one person kind of conflict and becomes a full-on war. So the country gets thrown into a lot of turmoil after the events at the end of book 1. And we get a glimpse of a new enemy, or a couple of new enemies really, on the horizon in the second book, and that kind of folds out into the third book. So I guess it gets bigger. I guess this isn't too spoilery, but Yukiko's powers, her ability to speak telepathically with animals, that kind of starts to grow beyond her ability to control, and that leads to a couple of conflicts and challenges for her that get answered kind of in the third book, really. But I guess bigger and better and flashier, maybe, hopefully.
Do you have any other projects in the pipeline?
I've just started thinking about what I'm going to write next because I'm waiting for notes on book 2, and I've finished book 3 at this point. I mean, depending on what notes and what changes we make to book 2, that will affect book 3. Book 3 is in a pretty comfortable place at this point, so I'm just starting to think about what I'm going to write next. So I've got a couple of projects that I'm tossing around. One is kind of near future sci-fi. One is, I guess it'd be more traditional epic fantasy. And the other idea I'm tossing around is doing a fantasy story with a kind of comedic bent, kind of along the lines of Terry Pratchett or Douglas Adams, to try and write something funny. People tell me that I'm funny. I don't really believe them, and I think writing comedy would be a hell of a lot harder than writing serious work, capital S serious. But yeah, I have an idea that I think could be kind of fun. So I'm kind of mulling over those 3 thoughts in my head, and what I traditionally do is write the first couple of chapters and see where it takes me, see if I like the voice and see if I like the way the story is shaping up. So I'll probably write all 3 of those for a little while and maybe send them off to my agent and see which one he thinks is working best, and we'll go from there.
Okay. I have a couple of questions from one particular fan. His name's Nathaniel Robinson. He wants to know if you still love him.
Absolutely.
And do you remember who he is?
Yes, I remember him very well. I love him like the stars love the moon.
He'll be very pleased to hear that.
I'll punch him next time I see him.
At one final thing, at the launch for Stormdancer, you had a friend wearing a copy of the novel on a chain around his neck. Would you like to tell us the story behind this?
This comes back to being a tragic nerd. I made a bet over a game of cards, and not like a cool game of cards like poker, like dudes sitting around smoking cigars and drinking whiskey. It was a Game of Thrones card game, Game of Thrones card game, and Andrew and I, my friend, had a bet over a particular match that we were playing, and if I were to lose this match, I had to name Andrew as my muse in the acknowledgement section of the book. And if he lost, he had to wear the book on a gold chain around his neck throughout the whole launch. And fortunately, I won that particular Game of Thrones game. So, yeah, Andrew, he was a man of his word, and he wore it all night, which was great to see.
I saw him take it off as he left Dimmicks, and somebody called him a Welsh and made him put it back on.
Good. You got kept honest. I like it.
Well, thank you very much for talking to Dark Matter today.
Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.